Ah, there we go.
Evening, everyone. We just thought we'd give other people just a few minutes to join.
Yeah, there's a few more logging in.
Someone's got an excited dog.
Yeah.
Is that yours, Rob?
Yeah. Oh, Leslie's saying hi from Devon.
Yeah. Dan, do you want to? We could probably start.
We're at 5 past, aren't we? So I think it'd be
go for it.
Other people can join us as they go. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our third Regenerative Ruminating meeting. Hopefully we've got an interesting evening planned for everybody. The plan for the evening is the usual stuff. So there's myself, there's Claire Whittle and Rob Howe, vets from LLM. We have Lucy, who is providing technical support as ever. And we're also really pleased to be joined this evening by Dr. Lindsay Wistance from the Organic Research Organisation, who hopefully will be able to provide a lot of additional information on the role of trees in regenerative agriculture, particularly in relation to minerals. So we've sort of sprung this a little bit on Lindsay. She's had to prepare in a bit of a hurry, but it'd be really interesting to hear what she's got to say. If anybody's got any questions as we're going along, please put your hand up. We can address them at the time or pop them in the chat, and we can look at them at the end. We're aiming to be finished by 8:30, so little bits from Claire on key minerals and monitoring, a couple of bits on me on the conventional methods of supplementation and a little case study, and then a bit on Rob on some more regenerative approaches, and a bit from Lindsay, and then some discussion and further questions. So we look forward to that. So just by way of a quick introduction, really. You all know that nutrition is a hugely interesting subject, particularly to us, and minerals sit right at the top of there, really, in terms of their importance. But even from this simplified version of Mulder's chart, you can see how complicated a subject it is. So there's no way we're going to get to a point of addressing everything in this meeting, but hopefully we can identify some areas that we can have some input into and some beneficial effects for our livestock. And also, as is always the case with these things, it's to get a bit of a discussion going, and really look forward to hearing from Lindsay some points as well that we may not have considered. So I'm going to hand over to Claire first for a bit of a review of the important minerals in terms of livestock. So over to you, Claire.
Hi gang, I'm just going to try and share my screen. Bear with me a second. I've got the same first slide that Dan has up on his. Hold on, just start from the beginning. So yeah, I remember being shown this diagram in vet school, all about the interactions of sort of minerals within animals and panicking, because I thought I needed to learn it all. And thankfully I didn't. But I think the important thing to bear in mind with this, as Dan said, is that these are only actually the interactions that we know about. So minerals are really, really complicated. And these are what we know about what goes on in the animal, let alone what goes on in soils, in the environment and everywhere else as well. So minerals are obviously really, really important, and we don't understand them all. And I'm going to talk today mainly about, well, only a few of them that are actually on this screen that you can see now. They are very important in terms of normal functioning of an animal. So things like immune function, muscle contraction, bone development are some examples. And what can happen is, if there are imbalances of minerals in our livestock, these can lead to production losses. And they could look like anything, basically from poor growth to poor reproductive performance, and even increased mortality. There are more likely cases probably of poor production in our livestock. So I would be ruling out things like liver fluke, parasites, etc. They'd probably be higher up my list. So I'd usually rule those out first in an investigation. Now, forage is important here. I know a lot of you guys are on sort of forage-based diets, and it varies in its trace element content because of a number of different factors. So whether that's soil pH, what type of soil you've got, etc. So heavier clay soils potentially will store more iodine. Whether that's available to the plant remains to be seen. But basically, this means animals on a forage-only diet are potentially more at risk of things like deficiencies or toxicity as well. So in terms of what minerals we've got, we should be able to click through. We talk about sort of macro minerals and micro minerals. So your macro minerals are things such as calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium I've put on here. And these are the ones we tend to focus on. There are others, so sulfur, potassium, sodium, chloride, etc., all of those as well. And then we've obviously got our micro minerals on here as well. So copper, cobalt, iodine, and selenium are the ones we tend to think about most in sort of livestock production. There's also, again, on this side, so manganese, iron, molybdenum, zinc. I don't know if Dan's going to talk about zinc. You like zinc? It's all about strong fingernail. And your deficiencies may be sort of subclinical, so you may not see overt clinical signs, but they might still be there. So calcium and phosphorus on our left-hand side, they're the sort of major mineral components of the skeleton. So 99% of your total body calcium of your cows or your sheep is actually in the bone, and 80% of total body phosphorus as well. So calcium, though, also has an extracellular component, which is only about 1%, but that's really important in things like muscle contraction, nerve function, and that's why we see if you have a cow with milk fever and she goes down, she can't actually get up because all of that muscle function's gone. There's differences in requirements, so depending on lactation, so for our beef and sheep as well as our milking cows, but obviously there's going to be a much higher demand for things like calcium in our milking cows versus our meat breeds as well. We don't tend to see that many problems with phosphorus in sort of our younger growing animals, not something we tend to overly worry about, but you can get sort of chronic hypophosphatemia there as well. And magnesium as well, so we know that's important for nerve transmission. It also has a role to play in enzyme function and carbohydrate metabolism. And cows and sheep can't really store it very well, so they rely on those daily intakes. And that's why when we see things like staggers or grass tetany, we get very lush grass in the spring, which is low in magnesium, and it also tends to have this sort of rapid transit through the gut, potentially when they've been housed during the winter. And yeah, so that's a really important one there. So moving on to our micro minerals or our trace elements. Iodine is my first one. So iodine is a mineral, it's essential to life, and it is found in really small amounts in the thyroid gland. And it helps basically to make your thyroid hormones, so your T4 and your T3, which regulate growth and metabolism. So we tend to mostly see iodine deficiency, and that can be either primary or secondary. And deficiency signs that we see, so we can sometimes just see fertility issues, and sometimes we can get these really overt sort of stillbirths or deaths, and then weak calves that die sort of fairly soon after birth. And we talk about sometimes this goiter, which is where you get this big thyroid gland, and sometimes you can see it in animals where there is an iodine deficiency in the dam, but sometimes I don't think we necessarily do see that, but it doesn't necessarily mean, again, it's not there. And that is basically a compensatory mechanism, so they can't get enough, so basically everything just grows a little bit bigger to compensate for that. So that will be sort of a primary deficiency, and then we can get these sort of secondary deficiencies as well. So selenium will be an example. So if we have a selenium deficiency, selenium is actually required to turn up one of our thyroid hormones, which is T4, into T3, which is actually the active form of the thyroid hormone. So if we have selenium deficiencies, sometimes we can see these secondary iodine deficiencies involved, and that's just talking about those pathways again and how everything's interlinked, and one thing can lead to another, and we won't necessarily know what's going on there when we see it. So iodine generally found in your soil and forage, so forage mineral analysis and things like that can help, and testing for it in your actual animals. There's a couple of different ways. We've been doing quite a lot of pools in organic iodine recently, and again, that looks at your dietary intake, so that's over a period of time. So we tend to take these samples when an animal's been on a diet for probably several weeks is the best time to do it. You wouldn't want to just take a sample if they just changed diets and you want to see how that's performing. So that's a good time to take that. Your T4 is sort of pretty immediate, but lots of different things can contribute to T4 status. So things like parasitism, nutrition, all different kinds of things. So we tend to do pooled in organic ID. I don't think, to be fair, during COVID, we've had a lot of struggles trying to get any ID testing done. We're just starting to be able to do it again at the moment. One of the labs is now actually testing again, but I know last summer when I was trying to take some samples for my block calving herds, we really struggled to get anywhere that would do it, and there's a bit of a lag on getting those results back at the moment. And as far as I'm aware, we're actually struggling completely to get T4 done anywhere at the moment, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, we can get the ID. We tend to do it as pooled. It can be quite expensive if you're just doing individual animals. So 6 to 10 animals usually in a group can be quite good. Try and get you a bit of an idea about what's going on there. Let's have a little look. I've got copper next, I think. Yeah. So copper deficiency, I would say we rarely see it now. In fact, we tend to find that it's more toxicity that gets reported. And the unfortunate thing with copper toxicity is that there's usually actually very few signs until an animal dies. With deficiency, there will be parts of you in certain parts of the country that may struggle with this more. We tend to get poor growth, again, coat, fertility problems, quite often to do with heifers. So we tend to find that young animals at pasture get poor growth rates and then a knock-on effect on their fertility there as well. If we do see deficiencies, they are more often tend to be what we call a secondary deficiency as opposed to copper pasture levels. So the secondary deficiency is usually based on what we call antagonism. So again, we've got people from all over here. So if some of you have had this problem, it would be really good if we could talk about your situation and what you do to sort of counteract this. But basically, what happens with secondary deficiency is if you get high levels of things like molybdenum or iron, sulfur, etc. in your forage, these react in the rumen with the copper and they form what we call thiomolybdates. Now, these basically bind to the copper, and it means that the animal's unable to absorb that copper, so it becomes unavailable to them, even if it's there in adequate amounts, but it will show up on your copper testing as depleted levels. So clinical signs, like we said, in young animals, you can get these classic signs. Again, I don't think we see them very frequently now. So you get this sort of depigmentation. So you kind of get like a grey, browny discoloration of the coat, and then you can see it on the ears. And then sometimes people talk about spectacles. They give this like spectacled appearance around the eye. And then again, just poor growth, ill thrift. You get this thin sort of dry coat as well. And then later on in the disease process, you can sort of get widening of the growth plates and legs, so you can get lameness signs. I've never seen it get to this point really. And then diarrhea. So if you've got high molybdenum concentrations, you turn that onto pasture, you get diarrhea, and then again anemia will creep in later in down the line. But toxicity is the one that we tend to see the most. So that can be generally it's used. We see it where animals are eating a lot of concentrate, which again, a lot of you guys won't necessarily be doing. In terms of testing for it, bloods aren't a very good indicator, so they're not a very good indicator of stored copper. So you can actually have normal levels of copper in your bloods, but actually your liver might be struggling there in terms of the amounts that are available. Liver biopsies are one of my favourite things to do, so they can be really useful. And quite often, again, I would say to my herds, potentially if they're getting into barring cows and things like that, is we get a liver biopsy off those animals, and we can check what their copper status is, but probably a much better test to be able to do. And again, if you have animals that are going sort of, you could do a post-mortem. They can take post-mortem samples from livers as well, and they're much more useful. Selenium. So selenium is again another trace element, and it tends to work alongside vitamin E. And it's similar. We see similar things with some of these as well. So we're talking again about stillbirth, so you can get weak calves and sort of white muscle disease, which I'll talk about a bit more now. So you can get a congenital form of selenium and vitamin E deficiency, which is these sort of stillbirths. These weak calves, they don't tend to be able to suck very well. They usually tend to die within a few days of starvation, or they get a secondary infection or something along those lines. And we can get this delayed form as well. So the delayed form is seen in calves usually about between 1 and 4 months old. And they usually get, if they have sort of sudden unaccustomed exercise, basically, so you let them out into a paddock, for example, following turnout, they can get, the clinical appearance can vary. So if you get skeletal muscles, then you can get sort of sudden stiffness, inability to stand, and then you can get respiratory muscles are affected as well. So the calf sort of presents with a respiratory distress, and then cardiac muscle. So if it's cardiac muscle, unfortunately, one of the first signs we tend to see is death without any real previous signs of illness there. So testing again, selenium you can test for. I think this turns up very expensive and we tend not to do it. We tend to use GSHPX, so that is an enzyme that contains selenium, and that's a proxy for selenium, and it works really well. It's a really good indicator of selenium deficiency, or and it's, yeah, so selenium you could do if you wanted to know a bit more about more recent selenium intakes, but as I say, it's very expensive, and the GSHPX I tend to find we use across the board. Again, you can use liver if you need to. And cobalt. So cobalt's a funny one, and it's, again, it would be interesting to know from you guys if you have pine in your area. So it's generally seen as a deficiency, and it tends to be restricted to certain geographical areas. Now, I've written there as well that for testing for cobalt for pain, bloods are pretty unreliable. Liver B12 could be slightly better, but it tends to go on geographical areas. People tend to know if they have a cobalt problem in their animals. Tends to be more common in sheep, can be associated with high levels of parasites as well. And what we see again is it's all about this ill thrift. So you get this poor appetite, reduced growth, and anemia there as well, and potentially sort of rough coats, which is what you see. So poor doers across the board, really. This was just, again, to say, and I've said it before in previous ones, is never underestimate the value of a post-mortem. So this is looking at copper toxicity, and I don't know if you can see, there's a bit of like an orangey colour to that liver. I should have put a normal one up so you can see, but it's normally much more red. You can see there's that tinge to it. And again, when you look at the blood there, when we see copper toxicity, we tend to see this sort of, we call it like chocolatey blood. It doesn't look very nice if you compare the two on the side. But right, I'm going to hand back to Dan. Oh, I'm not, I'm going to get out of there a minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So there's been two mentions there of Mulder's chart, which just shows the complex interactions that we're dealing with. But Claire has gone through a lot of the major minerals that we would encounter in work with livestock. And so I was going to talk a little bit about the conventional ways of supplementing them, and then look at a case study as well. So a lot of you will be aware of being able to get mineralized concentrate feed. So it's quite good. You ring up the mill and it arrives already mineralized, and you can feed it out in that form. Really, we should be able to control intakes, but it isn't quite as simple as that. You'll all know from feeding animals in large groups, if you're concentrate feeding them on the ground or in troughs, that intakes will not be equal across that group. In theory, there should be more ingredients contained in there. So there's, as well as the trace elements Claire talks about, there may be vitamins in there, in addition to things like cobalt and selenium, but it isn't suitable for all systems. If you're running a very extensive system, grass-based system, a low input system, then concentrate feeding isn't going to be right for everybody. So we look at some other methods. It's worth saying now that generally when animals are supplemented with minerals, we're looking at the salts of the minerals, although we can look at organic forms, so yeasts, and also some of the chelated forms, so attached to amino acids. Generally, the latter two will increase availability and uptake, but it isn't always as simple as that. There's certain minerals that will go against the trend there. We can also include in a TMR. That clearly is not suitable for everybody. So the example here of an extensive system with sheep who are fed extra forage at pasture, it isn't going to work for them. Interestingly, with a TMR, you would think intakes are more guaranteed, but you're putting a very low inclusion rate, 150 grams, for example, in a very large bulk of feed. And so we've had some issues recently where we've needed to bulk out the mineral in order to ensure that intakes are more consistent, because I think there is problems with mixing and what individual animals are getting versus others. And there is a cost implication to that. And it may be that a mineral pack is an off-the-shelf one, or it might be that it's made up bespoke for your farm and your needs, but there will be cost associated with that. So feed blocks. These might be more suitable for more extensive systems, but countless studies have shown that there's great variability in intakes. We'll have some boss animals, boss sheep, boss cows that tend to like the taste of it and will consume a lot of it, and others that will consume none or very little. So if you're relying on that as your only method of supplementation of minerals, it can be incredibly variable. They will often have other things in, things like molasses or salt to try and increase intakes, and there's an expense to that. You may also not want the energy associated with molasses and those extra ingredients. It isn't just our livestock that will eat from them, we'll get wildlife as well, which may or may not be what you intend to happen or a beneficial effect, and also ground damage as well. So on this picture we can't see it there, but where you have mineral blocks we'll get a lot of poaching and compaction of the ground, that when we talk about some of our regenerative principles, that doesn't really lend itself very well to what we're aiming to do. Drenches. Now, I'd be interested to hear the view of the group on drenches. I think they're quite widely used. I think they tend to be sold fairly well. An advantage of them is you know exactly how much they're getting. So assuming that our dosing equipment is correctly calibrated and being done by a competent person, you know exactly how much they're getting. Now, how long does it hang around in the animal for? I think some of that is debatable, and it will vary depending on the mineral we're looking at. And some things that don't have huge body stores will need to be repeated. So things like cobalt and iodine will only have a temporary benefit before they need to be repeated again. And a word of caution on drenches. I will hear people when we're doing reviews, herd health or flock health plan reviews, people will say, well, I drenched the ewes with this wormer because it had selenium in it. That isn't really a great reason for using a wormer when we don't need to, purely because of the mineral content. There's probably better ways of supplying those minerals. So that's just something to be aware of, but I'd be really interested to hear the views of the group on some of those drenches that I think can be sold well. There's quite a big difference between them, some major on their chelated mineral availability. Boluses. Now, not all boluses are equal. This is a really important thing to get across. It isn't as simple as ours has got more in of such and such than yours. In terms of their availability, they're not all equal, but at least we know what they're getting, and really we should know what they're getting every day, and every animal should get that, assuming they're not coughing them up. And so we're able to incorporate that into our rationing or to address specific mineral deficiencies. The challenge with boluses is that they contain relatively few ingredients. So things like cobalt, selenium, iodine, maybe copper, although be careful with that, as Claire said, and occasionally zinc, as Claire alluded to. I like zinc for the quality it gives my hair, clearly, but they don't all contain a lot of minerals and vitamins as well. So it's something to be aware of. And then we have some other methods that I've touched on. It may be that the members of the group are able to contribute to this a little bit more, but we have injectables, and we'll talk about those maybe in the case study. There's less and less of those available now. They have varying persistency. Some of the really long-lasting preparations we used to use are not available anymore. And then also there is direct application to grazing. So part of our holistic plan, our grazing and soil management, we can apply minerals direct to the grazing. The thing to be careful about there is it won't always sort out availability. So we may have secondary deficiency issues, as Claire touched on, and if we're just applying more of those minerals to the pasture, it doesn't necessarily mean they will be available to the plant or available to the animal. So I like that as part of an overall plan, but it can't necessarily be seen as a cure-all. So it would be interesting to know from you guys who is doing that. I know it's certainly widely done in certain countries, but I'd be interested to know who's doing it in this country. So this is what I consider to be a really interesting case study, and Claire has touched on some of the issues that were raised in this case. It was a dairy farm, and we had replacement dairy heifers that really weren't getting on with calving. So they'd be messing around for a lot. The farmer would go and assess them. They'd never really make any progress. The calves would be alive at the start of calving, And he would go, have to assist them in terms of calving. They may be born dead, or they may die very, very soon afterwards. And we were seeing some retained membranes as well. And this was happening far more in the heifers than the cows. That's not massively unusual. Our heifers tend not to be mineralised quite as well as our cows. But I'd be interested to know if anybody has any thoughts. Maybe it's difficult to shout them out, so perhaps think of them mentally. What do you think would be going on there? So it certainly sets some alarm bells ringing for us, and it tends to be one of those things that you think, oh, I know what's going on there. So when we looked at those clinical signs and the history, and we did some samples, we could see that there was low iodine present in the animals and low selenium levels as well. So you think, well, that's great, that fits with our clinical signs. They're not mineralized, we can sort that out. So we did. We put some iodine and some selenium containing boluses in, patted ourselves on the back and thought that was sorted. What happened? Well, lo and behold, there was absolutely no improvement to that at all. So we still had calves born with low viability, dying very soon after, a lot of stillbirths, and animals that weren't interested in getting on with the job in hand. So we went to a stage where we were putting 2 boluses in these animals. So at 100 days off calving, they got a high iodine bolus, and then closer to calving, they got a second one as well. So we were really putting the iodine in. And it's important to note that many of these minerals can be toxic as well, and their safety margins differ. So iodine has quite a wide safety margin. We're less worried about overloading those animals in that sense, but selenium has a slightly narrower one, so we do have to be careful, and we have to think about what else they're being supplied with. But even with our second bolus later on, closer to calving, this was having no improvement at all. So we went back and we did some more investigations, and we also got somebody else involved. So a chap called David Atherton, who worked for Thompson and Joseph, who was a top chap. He came and looked a little bit at silage mineral analysis and took a bit more of a detailed history. And we could see from the silage analysis that the forage on this farm was very high in sulfur, and we could relate that back to forage analysis as well. And when we talked to the client about what they were doing, they were applying ammonium sulfate. So rather than our sort of traditional ammonium nitrate, they were placing this on as a sulfate as well. So I'm not sure if anybody is thinking, well, what is going on here, if anyone's got any sort of alarm bells ringing in their mind. But it requires a slight bit of enzyme and hormone geekiness that Claire has touched on. So our main thyroid hormones are T4 and our active one of T3. And thyroid hormones are incredibly important for all sorts of metabolic processes, as well as immunity and further down the line, fertility and things like that. But what is really key is this enzyme and the requirement of this enzyme to convert T4 into our active T3. Now, this enzyme contains selenium. So this is what Claire was alluding to in terms of the selenium importance from an iodine perspective. But what happens in very high sulfur levels, this enzyme will swap its selenium for sulfur, and there's a great affinity of the enzyme for sulfur. The problem with that is that our resultant enzyme that contains sulfur as opposed to selenium is fairly useless at converting T4 to T3. So we were seeing symptoms in these animals of iodine deficiency. They were backed up initially by the blood results, also the selenium, and suddenly think, right, well, the selenium's involved in the conversion, that made sense. But what we didn't do initially was look at a holistic view of the farm. We were too intent on looking at the animal and almost looking for results that confirmed what we were suspicious of. And so it wasn't until, with the help of David, we went back and looked at silage and forage analysis and took a history of what was going on the farm that we realized what was going on. And we only saw this on certain years because on very wet years, a lot of this ammonium sulfate was being leached down to the ground, so we weren't necessarily seeing the high sulfur levels. But in very dry years, we were getting this big buildup of sulfur, and we were seeing these issues. So it was flaring up. So we then
Dan,
decided to
sorry,
refine our
Dan.
treatment plan. We looked at the soil management and what we were applying to the soil, and we looked at using a selenium injection rather than simply selenium boluses, and we were applying iodine to the skin of the animals pre-calving as well. And this has resolved his issues. And so he's not putting the boluses in them anymore. He's using, and we don't use the selenium injection because we don't have the same long-acting variant available that we used to. But through his altered soil management, we are able to sort out these issues and may mean that actually the supplied iodine and the supplied selenium is doing the job, and these animals have normal levels of thyroid function. So that's worked. So I thought that was a really nice example of maybe where we can get drawn down a route that is a bit too conventional, a bit too focused on results in the animal, lab results in the animal, and yet when we went back and we took a step back, and it did require the involvement of an external advisor to do this, we realized that he knew this because he'd worked in a lot of places next door to power stations where we had a lot of acid rain, a lot of sulfur application to the fields in that way, and so he'd seen this before. So I thought it was a really nice case, and I'd be interested at the end to hear some of your views on some of these things in trenches as well. So I'll hand over to Rob for a bit more of a regenerative view on how we supplement animals with minerals.
Thanks, Dan. Really interesting case study. Before I share my screen, Lucy, you just popped up then. Did you want to ask anything for someone? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's a question, Dan, you might be able to help Leslie, in the chat. So there's confirmed iodine deficiency in a group of lambs. Has anybody seen delayed second stage labour in low iodine situations? Can you see the chat?
So that was exactly what this client had presented with. I caught up with him last week to see how it presented to him. And Leslie, that was spot on. It was delayed second stage. So we had first stage cervical dilation, and it was delayed second stage that he was seeing. And we're always cautious about diving in too early, particularly with first timers. And yet when he was leaving it, that was a problem we were seeing. So exactly similar to the issue you described with the lambs there. Very interesting.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful, because we're coming up to lambing again now, and we don't want to repeat. So we're going to go and have a quick look at our sulfur analysis, see if we've got any sulfur problems with the forage, and see whether we can sort something out. My vet's coming on Friday, and we'll sort something out. Thank you very much. That's really helpful.
Leslie, have you done anything different in terms of your iodine this year?
We supplemented. We gave an oral drench of iodine about 8 weeks ago, and we did a test last Friday, and we're just waiting for the iodine results to come back. So we'll see what that says, but we haven't had those results yet. We do a metabolic profile 3 weeks out before lambing, and we test for iodine and other minerals at the same time, but they're always slower to come back than the basic profile. So we won't know yet whether the drench had any effect. But we've also upped our iodized salt licks. They've been having those, and they have a mineralized concentrate as well. So, but that's nothing different from normal, but the drench was in addition to normal. So we'll just see what the results say. I was interested when you said you applied topical iodine to the skin. Do you mean you just basically sprayed them with a 10% iodine solution, or was it something else?
No, you have to get your iodine type right. So we'd have used tincture of iodine in the past. So the iodine that we'd use for dipping navels doesn't do quite the same job.
Right.
There is a little bit of debate, and I'm not totally sold yet either way on this, as to whether the iodine is absorbed through the skin or they lick it off. I tend to hedge my bets and put it somewhere where they can lick it if they need to, or it's absorbed. So what this client does now is he wanders around the pre-calving shed and he applies it with a knapsack sprayer, and he's worked out how many sprays to get the right amount, which in cattle is around about 10 mil a week, something like that. And he says if they ever run out or they drop off that, they start to see problems again. And we'll often do that as a bit of an emergency approach while we're waiting for results, or maybe before the boluses or other supplemented iodine kicks in, we'll apply it in that way. When I've tried to look in the literature, I'd be interested to hear other people's views. I've never found anything convincing that says it's absorbed through the skin, but a lot of people will say it is. So I tend to work on both assumptions really. So yeah, tincture of iodine, we've now got a slightly different one because tinctures stopped being available, but it has to be a specific iodine that does that job.
Right, that's helpful. Thank you very much. It's all useful stuff. I'll feed back to my vet on Friday. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Whilst we're talking about that, I mean, there's lots of different approaches. Sometimes we mix it with something like glycerol for that to get it a bit gloopier. And if you do sort of take that, the fact that they like to lick it off each other. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has tried that.
That's a good idea.
Okay,
Sorry, Rob, just another question that's come in from Tim. Is iodized salt a problem for sheep pre-lambing as it is for dairy cows with udder edema? We remove salt licks from dry cows. Should they have 60 days off salt or less? It's in the chat.
Yes, yeah, so you're exactly right, Tim. Salt is one of the big drivers of udder edema, isn't it? In conjunction with things like exercise and that type of thing. But yeah, the first thing we do if we see a lot of udder edema in dairy cows is go back and look at the salt content of the diet. And if we're seeing a lot of udder edema, we would pull that off. It isn't something I've ever encountered in sheep, probably because we're not supplementing them with sodium in quite the same way. But also there will be a yield and a genetic type element to it. So I think the theory would be the same, Tim. I've been a little bit vague in my answer. So definitely with dairy heifers, we will pull the salt off them closer to, but it'd be interesting to see if anybody experiences the same thing with sheep. It isn't something I've ever come across udder edema in sheep, even in some of these very extreme sort of breeds. I'm not sure if Claire and Rob similar or if you've ever seen it.
I've never seen it as an issue, to be honest, mate. And it's like you say, dairy heifers, yes, but not in sheep, not been a problem.
Ditto. I don't think I've ever seen it. I the other day that had a random swelling at the back end, but I think that was a one-off, nothing to do with the diet.
How about you, Leslie? Is it you say you've upped your iodized salt levels pre-lambing this year? Are you close enough to lambing to be able to appreciate that if it's there, or are you still a little way off?
No, I think we'd see it if we were going to, because we've had 4 ewes lamb already, and we've got the main flock starting on the 28th. They're all programmed, so there's a big batch starting on the 28th, and they're all swelling up nicely, but there's absolutely no sign of anything untoward. They're not having massive amounts, they're having a 10k iodized salt lick in the pen with them, and they're only getting through that once every fortnight. So that's 1 between 50 sheep, and they're getting through it about every fortnight. So not dramatic amounts, I wouldn't have thought.
And there's probably the same sort of thing applies in that situation as it does with mineral blocks, in that if we assume that some of those ewes are probably getting more than their fair share and some less, if it was going to manifest itself, you would expect it to show probably in some. Now, a very interesting question, Tim. We've had a few outbreaks of udder edema and generally traced it back down to salt levels and this lack of exercise thing, and the whole exercise thing plays into type 2 ketosis and all of that type of thing as well, which is taking us slightly off on a tangent, but very interesting.
Okay. Let's see if has that worked? Can anyone yeah, brilliant. So we wanted to also ask the question whether regenerative approaches to farming might provide us with at least some of the solutions. And obviously we've gone through some of the conventional treatments there. And as always, create some discussion here and learn from your experiences and your knowledge. There's a lot of people in the audience who will have a lot of experience with this, and far more than us vets in new approaches to preventing mineral deficiencies, as an example. So I'm going to go through some of the, I won't go through regenerative agriculture in any detail, but I'm going to pick a couple of areas where it would seem to make sense that approaches would be able to help with this, and a couple of areas where there is some research. and then quite quickly hand over to Lindsay to look at some of the work she's been doing and get her take on this as well. So there's 5 or 6 main principles to regenerative agriculture, and I would imagine that everyone in the room, livestock keepers, are quite likely to be ticking off quite a few of those. So obviously integrating animals into a system, having permanent cover if you have permanent pastures would also give you living roots in the soil all year round. Perhaps diversity might be one of the areas where we might struggle in a livestock system if it's, for example, a monoculture ryegrass. So I'm going to focus a bit on that principle, diversity, and then also soil disturbance to some extent as well. So they're the 2 areas I'll focus on. So this slide, why is soil disturbance a problem? Well, I'm sure most of the people in the room will be well aware of this, but destroying the structure, the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, it also exposes the soil to UV radiation, which will kill off a lot of the light in there, and possibly other macrofauna like earthworms. But it also risks runoff, loss of nutrients, loss of topsoil, and in ploughing will release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So this first principle is about maintaining soil health, and there's various different ways. This is a picture of a direct drilling to avoid the need to plough, and obviously also if we can avoid chemicals that are potentially harmful for soil health too, whether that's pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, antibiotics, anthelmintics, nitrogen, and instead rely on those roots in the ground to keep feeding that soil health by pumping carbon or sugars into the soil and feeding that growth. So I guess the point here is that soil health will allow more bioavailability of minerals, and there's a lot of work on that, and the Pasture Fed Livestock Association have done quite a bit on that. Yeah, so this is just a slide to sort of show what we probably won't be doing in a livestock-based system, but some parts of the country, arable systems, this is quite a common sight. Yeah, and so coming to diversity, which is one of the principles, ideally we'd be seeing polycultures and not monocultures. So that could be varieties of rotations, but also within rotations having mixed species. And I'll come on to the access. So why is that important? Well, one of the key things is how deep the roots grow, but each plant does a slightly different does a different thing. So yeah, can one species provide everything? And there's a couple of slides here courtesy of Cotswold Seeds and Farm Ed. So can one species, if we've got our stock all out on just ryegrass, so that smaller circle in the middle, the root depth might only be 5 centimeters. So what's that doing for us? Yes, it's giving us a lot of biomass growth, but it's not reaching water or minerals deeper down. Is it going to make us drought resistant, flood resistant? Will it fix nitrogen? How much carbon is it storing? All of these things. So by having diversity of species will help with that. And specifically in this context, we've been talking tonight about minerals. So this diagram again from Cotswold Seeds just shows it's a nice graphic way to say you've got roots from different plants reaching completely different areas of the soil, that if your field has only been ryegrass repeatedly for year on year, then those minerals have become inaccessible, and you'll have only been able to extract out of the nutrients from the top 5-6 centimeters of soil perhaps. And then just to mention a really fascinating extra dimension to having diversity in our systems. This graph, if you look at the left-hand column, shows perennial ryegrass and the sort of the dry matter or the biomass that you can take off a field, and it's widely considered to be, you know, the most you can get off a field. It probably is, and it responds really, really well to nitrogen. And then you compare that to the next two green bars of chicory and red clover, which is going to be less. And you'd expect, if you average those three species out, you'll get what looks like around 10 kilos. And that's what you'd expect, perhaps. But the point of diversity is that actually you get what's called the over-yielding effect, or the Darwin effect, which means they work symbiotically, and because different species can do different things. So one might fix nitrogen, another might access water during drought, or drain water during a flooded period, or grow in the early part of the season or the later part of the season, and feed the soil biology. So the outcome from that land is greater by having diversity. And if you think about it, the most productive systems, ecosystems in the world, contain a lot of biodiversity. So almost finally from me, I wanted to bring up some research that has shown what willow contains in terms of its mineral content. And both zinc and cobalt are found in very high concentrations in willow compared to other trees. And I'm sure that Lindsay can talk us through this a little bit more. But it's not just minerals there, and we didn't go into cobalt too much, I don't think, but it's really a really common deficiency, especially linked with parasitism. And again, willow contains condensed tannins, as do a lot of other plants, which prove to reduce the parasite burden. It's also the natural, you know, we think of cattle and sheep as grazing animals, and they are, but they also naturally will be browsing as well, which allows for other benefit, you know, natural behavior. And if we have more trees, either in the hedgerows or infield trees or around the farm, so agroforestry, then potentially we've got more shade, more shelter, better mineral access, ability for cattle or sheep to display a bit more natural behavior, but then also a whole load of other benefits which maybe will come into play within elms, things like more drainage, so the root systems of a tree. I think we've got people in the audience that can again have direct experience of this, but the infiltration rates on some studies from a Welsh system showed that I think there was 67% increased water infiltration around trees, but not just where the trees were growing, also the other side into the field that might be ryegrass, extending meters into the field because of the root systems. And then obviously trees will be sequestering carbon and preventing, by infiltrating water, preventing runoff, loss of topsoil, and increasing on-farm biodiversity. And all of what we've been talking about obviously has a massive impact on soil health. And I guess the question is, by improving soil health and accessing more minerals that are currently locked up, using the principles within regenerative agriculture, can we reduce some of the problems that we see in conventional systems? And I'm really interested to hear what everyone in the audience has to say about that and their experiences. And also then to connect up to some work out there talking about free access minerals. So I don't know if anyone's done this, but there are people who've got the individual minerals set out so that the animals can actually go and choose them. So if we think again about nature, which you might say regenerative agriculture tries to mimic, a lot of animals, they don't suffer from mineral deficiencies, but they will actually go and search out certain minerals that they're short of. If you watch nature documentaries, you'll see that all the time. So yeah, if anyone's in the audience tonight that's used some of the free access minerals, I'd be really interested to hear from you too. So at this point, I think I will hand over, Lindsay, to you.
Yep, thank you, Rob. Let me just share my screen. Oh. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, I came across, just while I set this up, I came across some dairy farmers in America who were giving free choice minerals. And there was a real mixed response on whether they liked doing it or not. One of the problems with free choice was keeping them clean and keeping them safe. And quite a few farmers had made some homemade boxes, but had then left them out in the rain and were throwing more away than the animals were benefiting from them. So it does require a little forethought to get that right, and perhaps to do some mineral analysis to choose the most appropriate minerals to offer. However, I'm here to talk about trees, particularly how they can benefit the animals, and of course tonight is the focus is minerals. But I do want to reiterate some of what Rob was saying, that trees in the farm landscape do bring multiple benefits to livestock, and this includes a whole range of benefits, such as improving social behaviour, the ability for them to perform body care, which they do on a daily basis. It also offers shade and shelter, which are very important at different times of year, and of course food and medicine. And so this is what I'm going to talk about this evening. So all of our domestic livestock browse, and those familiar with cattle at least will have seen what they do when they enter a new field. The first thing they do is check out the browsing. So here is a graph of the percent annual diet composition for some of our domesticated species. So we can see for cattle over a year, their browse intake is around 12%. For sheep, it's around 20%. And for goats, this is 60%. Now, of course, this is when they have free access to these resources. However, there will be times of the year when intake will go up, and this might be, for example, in Mediterranean type climates where you have dry seasons in the summer, so they will transfer to browse, but it might also be early spring growth in temperate systems. So you can see for cattle here, it can increase quite dramatically to 55%, sheep 76%, and goats it's a whopping 93%. Now, of course, goats can tolerate browse very well. They have enlarged livers that cope with the extra condensed tannins, and they also produce a saliva which coats the tannins, reducing their effect on the digestive system. So here is some work that was done in the Netherlands, where they grew a hedge and then they watched heifers browsing on it over one spring and summer to see what they chose to browse. And you can see that the hedge is a good mixed hedge at the top. There are quite a few different species, but in the spring they're browsing. Almost 20% of their time spent eating is on browse, and the preferred species at that moment is hazel, hawthorn, and hornbeam. This is a palatability scale for trees that's been produced by the Woodland Grazing Toolbox. So these are the tree species that are typically present in Scotland. And you can see that aspen and willow are the most palatable, and at the bottom we've got beech and alder. Now they do debate whether holly and hawthorn are where they should be in the ranking, because they are heavily browsed at times, but they wonder whether there's sufficient choice around those trees. At this moment, I do actually want to say something about palatability, because we have a tendency to consider it to be something simple, just the hedonistic sense of taste, but it's much more sophisticated than that in reality. What's going on is there is an interrelationship between the senses, and then feedback from the mechanical and chemical outcomes of post-ingestive processes. And so this post-ingestive feedback effectively calibrates the hedonistic sensations and influences whether something is eaten at all and then in what amounts. And some research done in Australia was looking at the problem of vitamin E deficiency in lambs born at a time of year when there's very little green grass, which is the good source of vitamin E. But what there is available in these climates are shrubs with green leaves. But the problem here is that they have a high level of bitter condensed tannins. So these researchers conducted a study where they made lambs deficient in vitamin E, and then they gave them a novel source that was high in vitamin E, but that was fairly bitter tasting, and watched what happened. And the control lambs didn't transfer to the bitter flavoured food, but all of the lambs deficient in vitamin E transferred to the less palatable food until they had regained vitamin E balance, and then they moved back to the more palatable food that was on offer. And the researchers noted here that the lambs changed their behaviour and started feeding on the higher vitamin E food source before they could measure any kind of clinical symptoms from that deficiency. So they were suggesting that it was almost cellular communication rather than conscious change in behaviour. So before I talk about minerals, I also want to mention that trees actually offer comparable nutrition to grasses grown in the same environment. Now, I've chosen here some research that was done, actually carried out in 1917. These are trees that were traditionally used in Swedish farming systems to feed the cattle over winter. But it doesn't actually matter that this was done in 1917, because the story is still the same now, that trees offer similar nutrition to grasses and forbs grown in the same environment. I would like to point out that not all of these trees are voluntary browse species for cattle, but what they do represent are the species that were available to the farmer in those more difficult farming conditions. And they would typically feed the least palatable, so the older would be fed at the beginning of winter, and then they would keep the most palatable, such as the ash, for the back end of winter to perk up the animals just before they went back out to graze again. So if we now look at minerals, this is some work that was done at the Organic Research Centre in 2017. So on the left-hand side, we have alder. Now, I'm not going to talk about alder in terms of its mineral content because of its very low palatability. It's actually quite good in nutritional terms, but usually even deer won't browse on alder. It's one of the few trees that you barely need to protect at all. But I will point out that it has a high nitrogen content, which reflects its nitrogen fixing properties. So it's still very much of interest as a tree in an agroforestry system. If we look at the goat willow and the two arrows that I've included here, we can see that goat willow is a good source of both calcium and phosphorus, and it comes in a handy nearly 2-to-1 ratio, which is what we would be looking for. At the bottom here, I've put in a yellow arrow. This is osier willow. Who was it who likes zinc? Is it Dan? You might like to perk up here, because osier willow, or Salix viminalis, is a superb source of zinc. And in New Zealand, they have particular troubles with a fungus that grows in their grasslands. And in the autumn, these fungal spores cause facial eczema on their cattle. They can't cure it, but they can prevent it with zinc. and they've effectively polluted a lot of their land with drenching their cattle with zinc. So in 2012, I think it was, some researchers did some work with having browse paddocks for the cattle. They're already growing a lot of osier willow for land purposes, controlling soil erosion and things like that. So what they did, they took the cattle off the grasslands and they put them into these browse paddocks. And they also did a couple of controls where they sprayed zinc directly onto the faces of the animals, but they also drenched hay with a liquid zinc and then watched what happened to them. And they found that the browse was much more effective than the other two tests. The zinc lasted longer, it stayed in the body for longer, it was a much more efficient bolus, if you like, or addition to their diet. And they speculated whether the presence of condensed tannins was the difference here, but it was lasting for much longer in the digestive tract than the than the drenched hay. And the other thing I wanted to talk about with these particular results is this study was, the point of the study was to look at mineral content, but what was done was the trees were harvested in June, and then it was dried and it was fed as tree hay the following March. And the mineral analysis was done as fresh fodder. So when they were harvested in June, mineral analysis was done, and then it was also redone just prior to feeding in March the following year. And what was found across all of the minerals, both macro and micro minerals, the content of all minerals was higher in the March samples. So here, for example, I've pulled out magnesium in ash and in elm, which are our two traditional tree fodder trees. And you can see in the March samples, they've increased quite dramatically. And for elm, this represents a 49% increase in magnesium in the tree hay. Now, this is quite exciting, and particularly in organic circles, because a lot of these minerals, you know, they are problematic, and to find sustainable, non-contentious sources of minerals can be really quite an issue, and this is certainly an issue for the use of zinc and copper in pig farming. So this represents some quite exciting potential for finding good sustainable sources of minerals. So I'm not really going to talk too much about these images, but I do want to draw your attention to the quite grotesque image in the top left-hand corner, where we've got a steer on moorland. We know moorland is usually poor in phosphorus and calcium, and this steer has not been supplemented, so it's gone looking for a source of calcium and phosphorus, and bone is the obvious source. Now, it can be found in other livestock systems around the world where phosphorus and calcium are poor. I suppose one thing it does do is that it highlights that there is an awareness of deficiency in animals, and there is an ability to go seeking out food sources, even if they are abnormal food sources. They are capable of going looking for them. But one wonders whether perhaps growing a little goat willow in this environment might be somewhat kinder for the animals. Yeah, I wasn't really going to focus too much on the other images because they represent salicylic acid in the willow at the top. It's very, very good levels. But the bottom left-hand picture, while we were talking about minerals, this is an image from also from a farm in America where bicarbonate of soda is offered ad lib for the cattle here. And the farmer notices that as the as his cows transition from fresh grass to the more acidic silage, their intake of bicarbonate of soda shoots up. So they're using it as a pH buffer for the more acidic feed during that transition period. Yeah, so now I'm going to talk about focus on sheep with some research that we've done recently. So this is really looking at how trees can supplement sheep and various minerals, and I'm going to touch now on some of the minerals that we or that have been discussed over the evening, and I'm just going to present really some of the results that we found. So here is an image of cobalt, and I'm just going to explain some of the background to what these results mean. So we had 3 different sites. Site 1 was Berkshire, site 2 was Leicestershire, and site 3 was Wales. And then we took samples of oak, willow, goat willow specifically, and alder. And we took samples in both June and September to see if the levels of minerals changed over the summer period. Now the 2 lines represent the minimum and maximum requirements for sheep. So what we were specifically looking at was to see whether tree fodder could help supplement shortfalls in minerals from pasture throughout the growing season. And the particular focus here was lambs. So, for example, cobalt has its nadir in pasture, if you like, in late summer, early autumn, just when you want lambs to be kicking on and putting on that extra weight. Yeah, so what we can see is that oak, specifically the oak in Berkshire and the alder, largely across the board, but not from Leicestershire in June, they all at least manage the minimum levels, but willow is absolutely outstanding for cobalt, specifically goat willow. There is a little bit of variation in season, but not massively so, but there's a slight increase generally, at least in the willow, for there to be more cobalt at the back end of the summer. For selenium, again, it's a similar story. Oak can just about offer the correct amount of selenium for sheep across sites, but there was a very high level in the oak in the Berkshire site, and again willow is showing itself to be a superior tree for selenium. For zinc, I mean, this is goat willow, so it's nothing like as good as osier willow, but it's still a very, very good source of zinc. And I should also say zinc is very good for skin integrity. So for pasture-based systems, helping keep good, healthy hooves and the skin between the hooves, zinc is going to help with that. And finally, iodine, also oak at the back end of the summer, willow also at the back end of the summer, and alder. And I do hesitate to mention the alder. It clearly does have good nutritional properties, but again, if we want to be feeding alder, we have to find a way to make it more palatable. But perhaps it would work in a mix, or in a dried feed mixed in some way. So these are 4 minerals, I think, that have been discussed in reasonable detail this evening, and we can see that in some cases, at least oak and willow, are useful trees to have on farm. Now, I've included this table, not because I want to scare people, but I just want to show these were all the minerals that we analysed during this particular trial. And it's really just to demonstrate that there are some differences. So the stars mean statistical significance between different aspects. So, for example, with calcium, there is a big difference between tree species. There is also a difference between sites. So largely, when we're talking site, we're talking soil. So not just the species, but also the soil will have an effect on the quantity. Now in calcium, there's also a big difference between the June and the September samples. Some of these species, there is no difference. So for example, phosphorus, there was no significance at all between the species. There was very little difference between the sites, but there was a big difference in the time of year that the samples were taken. And so this is really helping us to develop an understanding of how perhaps we can tailor, if people are interested in using trees to supplement minerals, how we can tailor our choice of species, and if we choose to harvest or choose to allow animals to browse at very specific times, when those optimum times will be. Yeah, and that's what I have. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Lindsay. That was absolutely brilliant. I think everyone would share the sentiments there. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. It's been quite nice that we've been on a bit of a journey, haven't we, through the start of Claire's point on the important minerals, and then through to conventional ways of managing them. Then Rob touched on the more regenerative approaches, and then Lindsay's presented some really up-to-date research and some expertise there. So that's fantastic. There's been a few questions coming up on the chat. Rob, Claire, Lucy might have things to add as well, but I just made a note of some of them as we were going along. Tom made the point about his sucklers and his young stock, and that no supplementation occurs, and he asked about whether that was appropriate, whether we should be doing something. And I think Claire and Rob chipped in a bit about testing, but I thought it was quite interesting from the discussion that then went on, that if those animals are grazing a really sort of single species sward, then I think the likelihood is that they're going to suffer from a deficiency, or at least there'll be great variability. Whereas if they're in some pasture, and Tommy might be able to tell us what they're grazing and if there's any trees or hedgerows there, but if they're in a much more multi-species environment, the likelihood is they probably won't suffer the same deficiency. They'll be able to buffer it at times. So it's I reckon, a bit of an explanation as to how those sorts of systems are going to be better for the animal than one that is purely single species with very little else for them to graze.
Dan, should we ask Tom if he's willing to just tell us a bit about that system then?
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea, Tom, if you're happy.
Yeah, I mean, they are grazing sort of mixed species pastures, partly by default because they're very poor pastures, so they're full of weeds and different things, but they do eat a lot of things. Some of the cattle are on, as I was talking in the chat, some river meadow that has a lot of goat willow in, as well as a huge number of herbs and forbs, and there's very little grass. There's no ryegrass. Most of the grass is cocksfoot-esque, and probably some fescue in there as well. And then at the moment I've got half my cattle outside, and I've kept them outside all winter, but I've also got half of them in sheds or in open yards, and they've been fed just on hay, but it's hay from 3 or 4 different farms, because I buy it from whoever's got some old hay that they don't want for their horses or whatever else. So I'm hopeful that the hay coming from different farms with different soil types and possibly different fertilizer programs, etc., would also have a mix of minerals. So maybe that sort of diversity of sources of hay also helps. Yeah, that's probably it, really.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah.
There's some questions coming through on the chat there that hopefully Lindsay might be able to contribute to, relating to the exact location of the minerals in the trees, whether it's leaves, bark, stems, and then also building on from that, is anybody feeding dried leaves? It's a slightly different subject, but I know when people feed lucerne hay really the best stuff has the leaves incorporated it into it as well. So is anyone feeding dried leaves, and also where is the main location of a lot of those minerals, Lindsay, within the tree?
Yeah, well, I mean, like everything else, nothing's ever simple, is it? And I've been reading quite a lot about bioremediation, because they've done a lot of work, you know, using trees to suck up heavy metal pollution, and that includes copper and zinc, and that's really where the research has been done, but only for those two minerals that are of interest to livestock. And what they've found, I should say that they use osier willow for zinc, but they use black willow for copper. It's an accumulator tree for copper. And what they found with zinc, at least, and possibly with both, is that where the minerals accumulate changes over time. So as the plant moves from winter into spring, then there is a lot of movement of these minerals into the leaf. But as the plants move into autumn and you've got leaf senescence, then the minerals move back into the body of the tree, in the bark, but also in the wood itself.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Lindsay, you mentioned the word accumulator there in the context of the tree. Do you want to just quickly go over the three types that you were talking to me about earlier?
Yeah, well, again, this is another thing I've learned from conservation work, and looking at different strategies that plants have. And they act as if they have a gateway between the below ground parts of the plant and the above ground. And we have these three strategies, not just trees, it's all plants. So you have three different strategies. You've got excluder plants that they take up these chemicals, minerals, into the below parts. No plant can stop that happening. So they all take up these chemicals into the below ground parts, and the excluder prevents it from traveling up into the above ground parts. So what you see in your tree wouldn't necessarily represent what was in the soil. And then you've got the reflector plants, so they allow free passage. So what's in the soil will be what's found in the upper parts of the tree. And then you've got accumulator plants, and they actively transport these different chemicals. So, for example, osier willow is an accumulator of zinc. Black willow is an accumulator of copper. And I suppose those have a major interest in some way, assuming that they work in ecological terms and biodiversity terms. You know, that those are the plants really that are of most interest for the minerals we're looking for. But I'm not sure that they exist for all of the minerals. I mean, let's say goat willow. I mean, that looked to be pretty decent for cobalt across the three sites that we measured, but whether it would be considered an accumulator tree, I don't know.
Thank you, Lindsay. I found that really fascinating, and I mean, when it comes to practical application of what you've just told me, I immediately thought of maize silage, which is known to be quite, you know, devoid of mineral content, which is actually really useful, and one of the reasons it can work really well for dry dairy cows, if we're trying to avoid feeding excess calcium and phosphorus and things. So potassium, I mean. So I wondered whether maize might be an example of an excluder, but you know, I don't know if you
potentially. Yeah, no, I don't know. I'm still learning about trees because we came across these anomalies in our results, and I was just trying to widen my reading to make sense of these things, and I came across the bioremediation stuff, and it started to make sense. Yeah. But I noticed actually we've got Tim Downs on the call, and Tim has started to feed tree hay this year. I don't know if Tim wanted to say something about his experience. Hi, Tim.
Yes. Hi all. Yep, we've got a shed full still. We're getting through it slowly. It's a process. We thought we'd handle it a bit easier by chipping it. So we've borrowed a chipper off a nearby neighbouring organic farmer, and we're just putting bucket loads down in front of the dry cows. There is a bit of a concern that it's slightly high in calcium, but it's palatable. We're chopping it from probably 1.5 inch diameter down to all the leaves, and yeah, it's all disappearing.
What time of year did you cut that, Tim? Is that?
Oh, I think it was a week after Lindsay came to visit us. I think it was it November, something like that? I can't remember.
I think it was a bit earlier than then, because we'd gone into a lockdown, hadn't we, by then?
Yes, it was September then.
Yeah.
I'd have to look up the photographs. We purely wanted to pollard the 300 or so trees. So we decided, rather than just put them back onto the ground and let them be absorbed into the ground, we'd store them over winter. And I am amazed how they've stored. It is all edible, it's dry, it's green, it looks palatable. My concern was, are we going to get any other unforeseen issues like choking, like putting willow plants growing everywhere around the farm, which perhaps wouldn't be a bad thing, but I'd like to control them a little bit and have them where I think they're most sensible to have.
Tim, where have you stored them?
They moved around. They were a pain because we put them in one shed, then we needed that for loose cattle housing, and they're now in what used to be our old mill shed where we used to mill and mix our own, which is it's a fibre cement roofed sheeted shed with concrete walls, about 5 bays long. We've got it on 6 trailer loads with pallets on the trailer. First of all, I read somewhere that you needed to have air circulating.
Yeah.
So rather than just stick it in a silage trailer for them to sweat, we put pallets on. It seems to have worked, much to my amazement.
And the leaves were green when you pollarded them, were they?
Yes, they were green.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of sap, but not very much in there. We just chopped it off at 5 feet high. Some of the lengths are probably 10 feet long.
Yeah.
So putting them through a chipper, and what comes out, we're just sweeping up off the floor and off the concrete and feeding back to the cows.
It's interesting.
How long have you been feeding it for now, Tim? Sorry, just wondering if you've seen any issues or.
No issues really, Claire. We've been feeding it on and off. When we get time to put some through the chipper, we'll feed a little bit here and there really. So it looks a lot, but once it's gone through the chipper, it's probably only about 4 or 5 wheelbarrow loads per trailer load. So it's sprinkled around. I don't think we're overdoing it, but yeah, we'll see long term whether there's any consequences or issues. Touch wood. Nothing yet.
Tim, would you mind just sharing both the business reasons and also the potential animal health reasons or other reasons that you're doing what you're doing?
Business reasons is another sort of ability to harness energy and grow more fodder on farm without reducing the amount of grass we grow underneath the trees. So doubling up the surface area that will catch sunlight and grow forage, grow carbon. Other benefits from a business point of view, it looks better. You can add some more feed in. We're not having to buy in extra feed. And yeah, I'd like them to browse it in the field primarily. So pollarding was a second job that I didn't really want, but yeah, it's made sense to do. We need a storage area. It's early days with seeing whether we can manage it. I don't think we'll have a harvest every year off it. It's going to be once every 4 or 5 years, or I've got to plant up a lot more and then mechanize it more. but yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. There are other people doing it worldwide. Are we going to be damaging drains around the farm too much, or are we going to get more infiltration and storage of soil? I love that Cotswolds picture with all the different root depths, and I think willow will certainly head further south. From when I've done some drainage in ditches, there's willow roots everywhere. So yeah, it's a balance.
Thank you, Tim. That's brilliant. It was, in fact, it was something I meant to mention, or at least find a slide to represent. There's the concept that farming, actually, we're all farming sunlight. And what you've just said there, I wonder, Tim, whether you think that any dairy farm, no matter what the system, you know, even in an intense farm, might find a business benefit from this. And maybe you could give us a guide. Okay, maybe it's only once every 3 or 4 years, but what have you displaced out of your diet? And does that, you know, have you got any figures on that in terms of cost savings? Or
it's tough because we've got that many dairy cows and that few trees. It's one tree each, really. So the dry matter potential from each tree is not sufficient to sustain them through the winter by any stretch of the imagination. But how many trees will we need? What planting density? What cover of the farm? It was a trip to America that stimulated it from the start. A guy called Mark Shepard in America talks about permaculture and regenerative agriculture and harvesting the 3 tiers of the soil. So your ground level, and then mid-level, and then trees. So yeah, that was what led me to go down this road. So, and I'm not stopping, but it's certainly something that we want. And following Lindsay's trip out to see us last year, had a lot of advice from her, and she's got a lot of information to impart. It was fascinating. Ought to come back when we're allowed.
I'd love to, Tim. I'd absolutely love to. Yeah, I actually find it quite inspiring that you've taken the plunge to give it a go, because, you know, there's so much to learn, and all of the difficulties of actually handling these kinds of systems. And I can see that there was a question about losing leaf as dust, you know, and that is also an issue. And I've been reading up the Scandinavian practices and how they used to manage and look after leaves in particular, because that's the bit that gave the most energy, at least, if not minerals. And ash used to be a big problem. Now, ash is an important browse tree historically, at least across Europe, but it's also very brittle. So the way they used to manage it was to harvest it green and transport it immediately to the place where as close to where they were going to feed it as possible, so they would lose as little as possible. But, you know, I've also been thinking about whether there is a possibility to create. Wow.
That was done shortly before harvest. I'll try and find a photograph of them actually in their chipped form.
Yeah.
Oh, that's harvesting them on trailers. So it's a bit Heath Robinson, but it worked. And
well, I think it's quite good that you started with willow as well, because you know, they've got so many good properties. They do have antimicrobial benefits. It's not just, you know, the salicylic acid, of course, they're famous for the painkiller properties, but you've got fungicidal properties, you've got anti-inflammatories. So they're a pretty good all-round medicine.
That was what we were after originally, was the salicylic acid, the anti-inflammatories, the pain relief, and browsing infield for a TLC group of freshly calved animals, or animals that had a lameness issue or something, could go into that paddock. So yeah.
And it's worth noting as well that some research has been done on sheep. Now, they didn't know why the sheep were choosing it, but they gave them the opportunity to feed on different willow species with known salicylic content. and the sheep all went for the high salicylic acid. They don't know why they did that, but at least we know that they can tell the difference, and they were seeking it out.
Wow.
Brilliant.
See if I can find a picture. Never mind.
Lindsay, is it worth a plug for the agroforestry guide? I think it's free to download, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Yes, always worth a plug. Hang on, never very far away. There it is. That one. Yeah, it's on the Soil Association. They're the publishers, and it's free to download as a PDF. Yeah, I mean, it gets a lot of good feedback. This is not a criticism, but I would suggest it's not a handbook. It's more of an introduction. But it's a very interesting introduction to the different aspects of livestock, and including different choices for different goals and the economics of growing trees.
Video of us chipping it. With full health and safety monitoring as well. Everything was connected.
Very good.
Yeah, that's what it looks like dried. I don't know whether the colour will come out. It is slightly browner.
Yeah.
And that's what it looks like. Just looks like dust through the chipper afterwards, but palatable.
So how are you feeding it, Tim? Are you putting it on top of other food, or are you just putting it onto concrete?
Yes, putting it on down a feed barrier on top of silage and fodder beet and straw and hay, and all mixed together. But we don't have a mixer wagon. It's just sort of dropped out of that bucket that you saw. So it's through to dry cows because they're the ones that are closest to it, but not to the very close up dry cows.
Mm-hmm. So putting it on silage is probably a good idea because you know, the wetter
gives it a bit of moisture. Yes.
Yeah, it maybe captures the dust, the leaf dust.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. That was great. I was just wondering if Victoria has put up there that she's worked with goats overseas who are fed particular browse groups. I was just wondering if she wanted to fill us in a little bit on that, if there was anything they were trying to do in particular.
Hey, you caught me in the middle of eating my tea.
I didn't know.
For those of you who don't know, I'm Vicky Hudson. I work for LLM. In a previous life, I worked in Australia, and we had a lot of hospitalised goats who came in for a variety of reasons. And some of them came in through the RSPCA and had a variety of mineral and vitamin deficiencies, which we quite actively tested for them as part of court cases that these animals came in with. And so part of their treatment and progress towards being rehomed was treating them for all these deficiencies. And a lot of that also stemmed around giving them foods that they found appealing and appetizing that had those particular minerals in them. So there were certain plants that we actively grew around the university and harvested daily, or we got the students to harvest them, to be honest, by hand, and we feed to particular goats. And you often found that, as with you mentioned about the sheep going and particularly seeking out certain plant types, even before we knew it, because we tested these goats quite when they came in, we had identified quite a lot of their deficiencies, so it was things clicked into place quite quickly. But they would quite readily eat certain plant types that we'd grown, and the students would put in a variety, so they get a smorgasbord of different browsing plants, and the goats would make a beeline for the one that they needed. So I identified quite quickly with that. And there's lots of plants over there, particularly ones that have a bit more of an anthelmintic property as well, which we'd find that goats would readily eat. So yeah, it was great fun. And out of a general thing, goats, their favourite thing in the whole wide world, if they won't eat anything else, a goat will always love wild olive. Some people know it as African olive as well. So that's one that we were having a look, the researchers were starting to have a look into, because no matter how sick or sorry a goat was, they would always eat wild olive. That was that hospital wonder plant.
Thanks for that bit.
Wonder if it works for cows as well.
Possibly. There must be a wonder plant out there that if they don't fancy eating anything else, they'll have a pick at an interesting tree. So we might have to start harvesting a bit and seeing what they fancy, and then looking into what other minerals are in these particular plants.
Well, it sounds like it's got a similar reputation for goats like ivy has here for sheep. There's actually very little research done on ivy, on the benefits of ivy, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that if a sheep won't eat ivy, then it doesn't want to live. But then, you know, animals get poisoned eating ivy, so there's a lot to understand about that. But I suppose that's an important point as well. And we talk about poisons, and of course there is very little in the world that is an out and out poison. It's not really about what it is, it's about the quantity that's ingested. And like with humans, you know, we use what we consider like digitalis is a poison, but it's also a heart medicine. So it's very important that we understand quantity, but also from the animal's point of view, it's important that we understand that with diversity comes learning. And when they're faced with a diverse environment, they're also faced with an ability to learn and to manage their intake of different chemicals. And those chemicals can suit their health needs. And I think one of the important things about managing parasites through, for example, through condensed tannins, but also through copper. And we know that copper has a very good effect on homuncus in sheep and also ascari in pigs. But the beauty of offering plants with these kinds of chemicals in is that the individual animals can self-medicate when they need to. So we're not blanket drenching, or we're not dosing animals that don't require chemicals when they can go and find it themselves in the environment.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That was great, really good. Lots of interesting food for thought there, I think. That wasn't intended as a pun, I apologise for that. So I think we've done really well, and it's one of those subjects that we could continue to discuss all night. Thank you, Lindsay, for your joining and your contributions. I've learned a lot, I think everybody else has as well. And thanks for everybody attending. It's been another good turnout, so we hope to keep this running if there's an appetite for it. Hopefully we've got round most of the questions. I just see one on there from Emily about parasite burdens and chicken and egg slightly, and whether parasite burdens cause issues with mineral deficiencies, or whether mineral deficiency causes issues with parasites. Interesting question. There probably isn't a quick answer to that. I've always thought that a deficient animal is more liable to be susceptible to diseases, including parasitism. But I don't know if anyone else has anything to add. But I think that's been brilliant, really good. So any burning questions, please send them on email, and we will look to get another meeting teed up. But thank you very much. Thank you again, Lindsay, Lucy, for the technical backup, and Rob and Claire for the contributions. Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.